The bridge gave way with a sound like a gunshot, a sharp crack of rotted timber that sent Annie Ford's wagon lurching sideways into the rushing water of Cypress Creek. She had felt it coming a half-second before it happened, the strange soft give beneath the front wheels, and she had just enough time to think that she should have listened to the freighter who warned her the county had never repaired the span after the spring floods. Then the whole world tipped, her camera crate slid hard against her hip, and the mare screamed as the planking dropped away beneath them both. "Hold on!" A man's voice shouted from the bank, though there was nothing left to hold on to but a wagon seat that was no longer level. Annie went into the creek with the wagon, the cold water slamming the breath clean out of her lungs, and for one long moment there was only churning brown water and the panicked thrashing of the mare's legs somewhere close to her skull. She kicked free of her skirts as best she could, fighting toward the light, and broke the surface gasping just as a rope of muscle and horseflesh came crashing down the bank beside her. The rider did not hesitate at the water's edge the way a careful man might have. He put his horse straight down the bank into the current, leaned low out of the saddle, and closed a hand like an iron cuff around her wrist. "I have got you," he said, and hauled her up against his chest with a strength that surprised her more than the words did. "I have got you. Do not fight me." She had not planned to fight him. She had planned to breathe, which was proving difficult enough with the creek trying to pull her back down and her lungs still half full of water. She clung to his forearm and let him drag her up across the withers of his horse, a big raw-boned gray gelding that stood steady in the current like it had done this exact thing 100 times before, which perhaps it had, given what she would later learn about the man riding it. He got her to the bank, swung down, and pulled her the rest of the way onto dry ground before he even looked at her face. "The mare," Annie managed, coughing water. "My horse, she is still down there. She will drown." "She will not." He was already moving, unwinding a coil of rope from his saddle with hands that did not fumble despite how fast they moved. "She is caught on the old pier timber, not going under." "Stay put." Annie did not stay put. She never had been good at staying put, not in 26 years of living, and she was not about to start while her father's camera equipment was somewhere at the bottom of Cypress Creek, and her mare was fighting for her life 20 feet away. She scrambled up, soaked skirts dragging like lead, and followed him to the bank in time to see him wade back into the current without so much as a second thought for his own boots. He talked to the horse the whole time. That was the thing she would remember later, turning it over in her mind on quieter nights than this one. He did not shout or curse or fight the mare's panic with more panic of his own. He kept his voice low and even, the way a man might speak to a frightened child, telling the horse in a steady murmur that she was doing just fine, that he was not going to let her go under, that all she needed to do was quit fighting the rope and let him bring her in. It took him the better part of 10 minutes. Annie stood on the bank with her arms wrapped around herself, shivering despite the June heat, and watched a stranger gentle a drowning horse out of a flooded creek with nothing but patience and a low voice. And she thought, quite clearly and quite unexpectedly, that she had never in her life seen anything so purely competent. When he finally led the mare up onto solid ground, both of them dripping and blowing hard, he turned to look at Annie properly for the first time. He was younger than she had guessed from his voice, perhaps 30, with a sun-weathered face, and eyes the pale gray-green of creek water under willow shade. His shirt was plastered to a lean, hard-worked frame, and there was a thin line of blood at his temple where something had caught him in the water. "Micah Fairchild," he said, as though introductions were the most natural thing in the world for two people who had just nearly drowned together. "You are bleeding some yourself, ma'am, at the shoulder there." Annie looked down and found he was right. She had not felt it happen. "Annie Ford," she said, "I run the boarding house in town, and I believe I owe you my life, Mr. Fairchild, along with the life of my horse, which my father would have minded a good deal more than his own daughter, so you have done me a double kindness." That got a flicker of something at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile but the shape one might grow into. "Anybody would have done the same." "Anybody did not," she said. "You did." "I saw 3 men on the far bank when the bridge went, and not one of them so much as swung down off his wagon seat." He shrugged that off the way men who did brave things always seemed to, as if bravery embarrassed them more than danger ever could. He helped her retrieve what could be salvaged from the wrecked wagon, which was not much. Her camera, a heavy wet plate contraption that had been her father's pride, was cracked along its wooden housing and would need weeks of careful repair. Her chemical bottles were scattered, and half of them broken against the creek stones. But the lens itself, wrapped in its oilcloth, had survived, and Annie held it to her chest like something precious, while Micah Fairchild worked the wagon free of the ruined bridge timbers with the same patient strength he had shown the horse. "That bridge has needed mending since March," he said, examining the broken span with a scowl that told her this was not the first time he had thought poorly of the county's road commissioners. "I told Kendrick myself, back when he was still calling himself a friend to every rancher on this creek. Told him the county funds were meant for repairs like this one. He said it would be seen too." "Cyrus Kendrick," Annie repeated, and something in her tightened at the name the way it always did lately. "He tells a great many people a great many things, Mr. Fairchild. Whether they come to pass is another matter entirely." He looked at her sideways then, curious, but did not press. It was one of the first things she would come to admire in him, that he did not press a woman for more than she offered freely. He simply helped her load what remained of her belongings onto his own horse, walked her and the limping mare the 3 miles back into Larkspur Crossing himself, and left her at the door of her boarding house with a tip of his soaked hat and a promise, offered so plainly it did not feel like flirtation at all, that he would call on her in a few days to see that she had mended as well as her camera. Annie stood on her own porch, dripping onto the boards, and watched him lead both horses away down the dusty street, and thought that whatever else June of 1878 was going to bring to Larkspur Crossing, it had already brought her something worth paying attention to. The town of Larkspur Crossing sat where Cypress Creek bent hard around a limestone bluff before joining the Brazos, a spot the surveyors had liked well enough 30 years earlier to plant a courthouse and a livery, and never look back. By the summer Annie Ford turned 26, it had grown into a proper cattle town, swollen fat on the traffic of the Western Trail that carried Texas Longhorns north to the railhead at Dodge City. Trail crews came through by the hundreds that June, dust-caked and trail-weary, spending their wages on whiskey and haircuts, and the kind of company that made the church ladies purse their lips. Merchants had grown rich on flour and cartridges and horseshoe nails. And into all of that commerce and dust and cattle-bawling noise had come men like Cyrus Kendrick, who understood that the real fortune to be made on a frontier was not in driving cattle at all, but in owning the land the cattle crossed. Annie's boarding house stood 2 streets back from the courthouse square, a long clapboard building her father had built with his own hands after the war, when he had come west from Georgia with a camera, a limp, and very little else. Nathaniel Ford had photographed half the county in his years in Larkspur Crossing, wedding portraits and funeral portraits and stiff-backed family groupings taken in the good light of the parlor. He had converted into a studio. He had died 3 years back of a fever that took him inside of a week, and left Annie the boarding house, the studio, and every piece of equipment in it, along with an unspoken expectation that she would keep both going, which she had, through sheer stubbornness and a head for figures that her father had never quite possessed. She kept 11 rooms let out most months of the year, to drummers and drovers and the occasional family passing through on the way to somewhere better. She cooked supper for whoever was under her roof and served it at a long table where conversation ran as freely as the coffee, and in 3 years of listening at the head of that table, Annie Ford had come to know more of the private business of Larkspur Crossing than the sheriff, the preacher, and the newspaper editor combined. It was at that table, 4 days after the bridge went out from under her, that she first heard Cyrus Kendrick's name spoken with real fear in it. "He is going to take the Hale place," said Constance Hale herself, Sitting stiff and pale at the foot of the table with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup she was not drinking from. She had come to board a week earlier, having sent her 2 boys to stay with her sister, while she tried to sort out what she called a misunderstanding with the loan office. "He says Walter missed the March payment." "My husband did not miss any payment, Mrs. Ford. I watched him count that money out myself and hand it across Elias Prute's own desk, and now there is no record of it at all." "Perhaps Mr. Prute misfiled the receipt," offered one of the drummers down the table, a peddler of sewing notions who had clearly not been paying close enough attention to the widow's tone. "Elias Prute does not misfile anything," Constance said. "That man could find a pin in a haystack blindfolded." "No, somebody took that entry out of the ledger, and I know why, because Mr. Kendrick has been asking around about buying up the creek bottom since April, on account of the railroad men saying they might run a spur line through there. My land is worth 10 times what it was 2 years back, and now suddenly I am in default." Annie set down the bread she had been slicing and looked hard at the widow. "You are not the only one, are you?" Constance's mouth trembled before she got it steady again. "The Draytons lost their place in May, the Ochoa family before that. Everybody says it is bad luck, drought money gone wrong, but I do not believe in that much bad luck all landing on land that happens to sit square in the railroad's path." The table had gone quiet, the way tables did in Annie's boarding house when something true and uncomfortable finally got said out loud. Annie looked around at the faces gathered there, drovers and drummers and one worn-down widow, and felt something settle into place inside her chest, cold and clear as creek water. She had heard whispers of this before. Everyone in Larkspur Crossing had heard whispers of it. But whispers were easy to dismiss, and Cyrus Kendrick was a large man in every sense that mattered in a town like this one, a founding investor in the bank, a deacon at the Methodist Church, a man who had personally funded the new schoolhouse roof the previous autumn to considerable public gratitude. He was not the sort of man people accused lightly. But Annie Ford had grown up watching her father develop photographs in a darkened room, learning patience for the slow emergence of truth out of what looked, at first, like nothing at all. She knew that a thing could sit hidden in plain sight for a long while before the right light and the right chemistry brought it forward. She thought perhaps it was past time somebody held Cyrus Kendrick's ledgers up to a stronger light. Micah Fairchild's ranch sat 8 miles north of town along Cypress Creek, a modest spread of good grass and better water that his father had homesteaded before the war, and that Micah had built up, horse by horse, into the finest breaking and training operation between Fort Worth and the Panhandle. Trail bosses brought him their spookiest, most ruined stock, horses that had been beaten into submission or terrified past reason by rough handlers. And Micah gentled them the way he had gentled Annie's drowning mare in the creek, with patience that seemed to have no bottom to it and a quiet certainty that no animal, however wild, was beyond reaching if a man was willing to go slow enough and listen hard enough. He came into town 8 days after the bridge collapsed, exactly as promised, leading a Greenbroke sorrel gelding on a loose lead, and wearing a clean shirt that Annie suspected he had put on specifically for the occasion, though she would never have said so. "You are looking considerably drier than the last time I saw you," he told her when she came out onto the boarding house porch to meet him. "I am generally drier than that," Annie said. "It was an unusual afternoon. I am glad to see it did not keep." He nodded at the shoulder she had cut on the wreckage. "How does that mend?" "Well enough. My camera fared worse than I did, if you want the honest truth of it. Cracked the housing clean through." She had spent 3 evenings gluing and clamping the ruined wood back into some semblance of usefulness, cursing her father's memory the whole while for building the thing so heavy it had nearly taken her down with it. "I might could look at it," Micah offered. "I do some carpentry, mending harness and the like. Wood is wood." "That is a kind offer, Mr. Fairchild, but I suspect a camera housing wants a gentler hand than harness leather." "I have a gentle hand," he said, entirely without guile, and then seemed to hear how that sounded and looked faintly embarrassed by it, which Annie found she liked considerably more than if he had meant it as a line. She let him look at the camera anyway, curious to see if his claim held up, and stood in the doorway of her father's old studio, watching him turn the cracked housing over in his hands, with the same careful attention he must have given 100 frightened horses. He found the split grain, tested the give of it with his thumb, and set about explaining how he would clamp and glue it so it would hold true, using words that made it clear he had actually built things with his hands rather than merely talked about doing so. "You take photographs for a living," he said, while he worked, nodding toward the studio's back wall, hung with a dozen framed portraits her father had taken over the years. Somber-faced families in their good clothes, a young soldier who had likely not lived to see the war's end, a wedding couple stiff with the effort of holding still for the long exposure. My father did mostly. I help drovers who want a likeness sent home to their mothers and sweethearts, and I do landscape work for the newspaper on occasion. It pays less than the boarding house does, but I would not give it up. Why not? Annie considered the question longer than it probably deserved, because no one had actually asked her that before, only assumed the answer or not cared to know it. Because a photograph does not lie, Mr. Fairchild, not the way people do. You can dress a thing up, choose your angle, wait for good light, but in the end the plate shows what was actually standing in front of the lens when the shutter opened. I find that comforting in a town where a good many people are inclined to tell you a story instead of the truth. Something shifted in his face at that, thoughtful. "You have been hearing about the Hale place, then, and the Draytons?" "I have been hearing about a good many places," Annie said carefully. "Have you?" He set the camera housing down and looked at her directly, and there was no more shyness in it now, only a grim sort of honesty. "I got a notice from the loan office 2 days back. Cyrus Kendrick says I am in default on the note my father took out during the drought of '74, 3 years running current, paid every March like clockwork, and now his ledger says I missed the payment last spring. He is giving me until the 4th of July to make it good, principal and penalty both, or he forecloses and the ranch goes to auction on the county courthouse steps." Annie's stomach went tight and cold. "That is 3 weeks. 3 weeks, Micah agreed. "And I do not have that kind of cash sitting idle. Not with half of it tied up in horseflesh I cannot sell fast enough to matter, and the rest already paid to a man who is now telling me I never paid it at all." "Do you have your receipt?" "I have a receipt saying I paid the bank draft. I do not have any way of proving what he did with the money once it went into his ledger, and he is the one holding the ledger." Annie stood very still in the studio doorway, feeling the shape of something dangerous and important settling into focus in her mind, the way an image gathered itself slowly out of the developing bath. "Mr. Fairchild," she said, "I believe you and I ought to have a longer conversation than the one we are currently having, and I believe it ought to happen somewhere Cyrus Kendrick is not likely to overhear it." He looked at her for a long moment, gray-green eyes steady, and something passed between them that was not quite trust yet, but was very close to its beginning. "I am inclined to agree with you, Miss Ford," he said. "Where would you propose?" Elias Prout was a thin, nervous young man of perhaps 24 who had clerked for Cyrus Kendrick's loan office for the better part of 3 years, and who boarded, as it happened, in the smallest and cheapest room in Annie Ford's boarding house, a fact she had not thought much of until Constance Hale's coffee had gone cold at her supper table. Annie found him on the boarding house porch 2 evenings later, smoking a cigarette with hands that shook slightly, and sat down beside him without asking permission. The way she had learned over the years was often the fastest route to an honest conversation. "You look like a man carrying something heavy, Mr. Prout." He did not answer right away. Down the street, a trail crew was singing something rowdy outside the saloon, and a wagon rattled past behind a team of mules, and Elias Prout watched all of it with the fixed stare of a man who was not really seeing any of it. "I cannot talk about the office's business, Miss Ford. Mr. Kendrick is very particular about that." "I have not asked you to talk about the office's business," Annie said. "I have only observed that you look unwell, and that Constance Hale looked considerably worse the night she sat at my table and said her husband's payment had vanished clean out of the ledger. I am not asking you to betray a confidence, Mr. Prout. I am asking whether a young man who keeps careful books might be troubled by watching careful books turned into something else." He was quiet a long while, long enough that she thought he might simply get up and go inside without another word. Then he said, very low, "I did not alter anything, Miss Ford. I want you to know that first. Whatever else is true, I never touched a single entry that was not already true when I wrote it. I believe you. But I have watched entries change after I wrote them. Payments that I recorded myself in my own hand that are no longer there when I go back to check the book a month later. Ink that does not quite match. Pages that have been recopied so smooth you would never know, unless you happen to remember writing the original yourself." His voice had dropped almost to nothing. "I have thought about going to the sheriff. I have thought about it every night for 2 months. But Mr. Kendrick holds my own family's note on our place down near Comanche, and he has made it plain, without ever quite saying the words, what would happen to that note if I made trouble for him." Annie felt the cold certainty in her chest harden into something like resolve. What if there were a way to make trouble for him that he could not trace back to you at all? Elias Prout looked at her then, really looked, and something in his thin, frightened face loosened just slightly, the way a man's shoulders drop when a weight he has carried alone is suddenly shared. "What did you have in mind, Miss Ford?" she told him. It was not a complicated plan, not at first, only that she wanted to see the ledger for herself, and that she understood there existed, in the loan office's back room, an older set of books from before Kendrick's newer clerk-friendly system, books that Prout himself had kept faithful entries in for 2 years before the trouble started, and that if those old books still held any record of payments now missing from the current ledger, a photograph of those pages, taken before anyone had a chance to alter them further, would be a kind of proof that could not later be denied or recopied away. "You want to photograph the ledgers," Prout said slowly. "I want the truth held still long enough for other people to see it," Annie said. "That is what a photograph does, Mr. Prout. It does not care what story a man wants to tell afterward." He agreed in the end, though it cost him a sleepless night and a good deal of pale, sweating hesitation. 3 days later, on a Sunday afternoon when Kendrick had ridden out to inspect a parcel of land near the proposed railroad survey, and the office stood empty but for Prout himself, Annie carried her Mendied camera and a folding stand through the back alley door of the Larkspur Land and Loan office, her heart beating hard enough that she could feel it in her throat, and photographed 11 pages of ledger entries by the light of the office's own back window. Working as fast as her father had ever taught her to work, plate after plate, while Elias Prout stood watch at the front window with a face gone the color of old paper. She did not know yet, sliding each exposed plate carefully into its protective case, precisely what she had captured. That would take chemistry and time and the darkened corner of her own studio. But she knew the shape of it, the way she always knew when a scene in front of her lens held something worth keeping. Constance Hale's March payment, recorded in Prout's own careful hand in the old ledger, dated and initialed, present as day in a book that predated whatever had been done to erase it from the newer one. She was 3 streets from the boarding house, camera case heavy against her hip, sun sliding low and gold across the dusty street, when Cyrus Kendrick's shadow fell across her path. He was a solidly built man of perhaps 50, silver at the temples, dressed always a shade too finely for a cattle town, in a black coat that must have been unbearable in the June heat, and that he wore anyway because it made him look, he no doubt believed, like a man of consequence. He smiled at her the way he smiled at everyone, broad and warm and entirely without feeling behind it. "Miss Ford, out with your camera on a Sunday. Business must be good." "Business is always good when a town is growing as fast as this one, Mr. Kendrick. She kept her voice light, though her fingers had tightened involuntarily on the case handle. "I hear you had some trouble at the creek bridge a few weeks back." His eyes did not leave her face. "Terrible state that bridge was in. County ought to see to those repairs faster than it does. I have said as much to the commissioners myself. How fortunate that a man of your influence takes such an interest in our infrastructure." "I take an interest in a great many things concerning this town, Miss Ford. I find it pays to know what is happening in it." He let that sit a moment, and Annie understood with a cold clarity that this was not idle conversation, that he was telling her something and watching to see how she received it. "I understand you have taken an interest of your own of late, in matters that do not concern you. I run a boarding house, Mr. Kendrick. A great many matters pass through my dining room that I have no particular say over." "Of course." His smile did not shift, but something behind his eyes went flat and hard. "I would hate to see a young woman running a respectable establishment get herself tangled up in business she does not fully understand. Loan offices are complicated things. Ledgers, interest schedules, penalty clauses. Easy for an outsider to see shadows where there is only ordinary bookkeeping. I would hate for such misunderstandings to cost anyone anything they valued." "Is that a warning, Mr. Kendrick?" "It is a kindness, Miss Ford. I am told you value your boarding house a great deal. I would hate to see its good name suffer over careless talk." He tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy and walked on down the street, and Annie stood very still until he had rounded the corner, her heart hammering, before she allowed herself to walk the rest of the way home at anything faster than a measured, deliberately unhurried pace. She told Micah everything that evening, out by the corral fence where he was working a spooked young Mustang mare that trail hands had brought him 3 days before, a wild-eyed sorrel that flinched from every quick movement and had bitten one careless cowhand badly enough to need stitching. Micah moved around the animal in slow, unhurried circles while Annie talked, never approaching directly, letting the mare choose when to close the distance between them, and Annie found herself watching the horse's ears soften and turn toward him even as she recounted Kendrick's veiled threat. "He as good as told me to stop," she finished, "which tells me I am close to something worth stopping." "He threatened you." Micah's voice had gone very quiet, and Annie noticed the Mustang's ears flick nervously toward that quiet, sensing tension in it despite the gentleness of the tone. "He threatened my boarding house. There is a difference, though I grant you it is a fine one." "Not fine enough." He stopped circling and stood still, letting the mare settle before he spoke again, and Annie understood he was deliberately not looking at her, working to keep his own anger from bleeding into the animal's fragile trust. "I ought to go have a conversation with the man myself. You ought to do nothing of the kind." Annie came up to the fence rail, close enough now that the mare's eye rolled toward her too, wary but curious. "A conversation with a man like Kendrick is not one with fists or a raised voice, Mr. Fairchild. It is one with proof. I have 11 photographic plates sitting in my darkroom that may hold exactly that proof, once I have developed them properly. And if you go riding into town to threaten a land baron with a hearing 3 weeks off, you will hand him every excuse he needs to have you arrested before that hearing ever happens." He turned to look at her then, and something in his expression had shifted, some frustration giving way to a grudging, surprised respect. "You have thought this through further than I have. I have had longer to think on it. I have been chasing this particular shadow for a week. You have been chasing it for 2 days. All right." He said it simply, without argument, and went back to his slow circling of the Mustang, and Annie felt something warm uncurl in her chest at how easily he had done it, set his own instinct for action aside in favor of her judgment, not because he lacked will of his own but because he trusted hers. She had known very few men in 26 years who could do that without it costing them something in their own estimation. "You are not going to ask me what my plan actually is," she said, half teasing. "I expect you will tell me when it is ready to be told." The Mustang took one cautious step toward him, ears pricked forward now, nostrils working. In the meanwhile, I find I am better used gentling this mare than I would be gentling my own temper in front of Cyrus Kendrick." Annie laughed, surprising herself with the sound of it, and the Mustang startled sideways at the noise before catching herself, ears swiveling back toward Micah as if for reassurance. He murmured something low to the animal, something Annie could not quite make out, and the mare settled again, and Annie stood at the fence rail in the long gold light of a Texas evening, and thought that she had perhaps never watched anything as quietly beautiful as a man that patient with something that frightened. The photographs, once developed, told exactly the story Annie had hoped they would. Working alone in her darkened studio 2 nights later, chemical fumes stinging her eyes, she watched image after image emerge from the developing bath, Elias Prout's careful handwriting rising up out of the pale paper like something surfacing from deep water. Constance Hale's March payment, dated and initialed. A payment from Micah's own account the previous spring, recorded in the same old ledger, matching the receipt he had shown her, present in the earlier book and mysteriously absent from the current one. 3 other names besides, families Annie recognized from her own dining table over the years, each with a payment recorded faithfully in Prout's old hand and vanished from Kendrick's newer records. It was, she thought, staring at the drying prints pinned along a line strung across her darkroom, exactly the kind of quiet, damning evidence that could bring down a man who had built his fraud on the assumption that no one would ever think to look, or would lack the means to prove it if they did. She should have felt triumphant. Instead, walking back to the boarding house in the dark with the prints wrapped carefully in oilcloth against her chest, she felt only a cold, prickling unease, the sense of eyes on her back that she could not quite shake, and did not manage to shake it fully until she had bolted her own bedroom door behind her. The unease proved well-founded 3 days later, when Elias Prout did not come down to breakfast, and his room was found empty, his few belongings gone, and no one in Larkspur Crossing could say where he had gotten to or when he had left. Annie's first fear was that Kendrick had done something terrible to the young clerk, but a note left tucked under Prout's pillow, discovered when Annie went up to check the room herself, eased that fear only slightly. It was written in his careful hand and said simply that he had grown too afraid to stay, that Kendrick had confronted him about missing ledgers and he feared for his family's note in Comanche, and that he was sorry, so sorry, but he could not be the one to stand up in a courtroom and say what he knew. He hoped Miss Ford would forgive him. He hoped the photographs would be enough without him. They would not be enough without him, not entirely, Annie knew. A photograph of a ledger page was powerful evidence, but a circuit judge would want testimony behind it, someone to swear that the old ledger was genuine and the new one altered, and with Prout gone, that testimony had gone with him. She was sitting with that grim knowledge at her kitchen table, coffee gone cold in front of her, when Micah Fairchild came through her door without knocking, which he had never done before, his face drawn tight with an urgency that made her rise from her chair before he had said a single word. "2 of Kendrick's men came out to my place this morning," he said. "Boone Sackett and Ray Tolliver, you know the sort, hired muscle he keeps around for collections work. Told me I had best not be planning to go poking around loan office business before my hearing, on account of accidents happen easy out on Lonesome Ranch roads. Another threat, not the kind I intend to sit still for." His jaw was set hard, and for a moment Annie thought he had come to tell her he was riding into town after all, judgment and consequence be damned. But instead he said, "I want you to stay close to town the next few days. Do not ride out alone. I do not trust what Kendrick might try, now that his clerk has run and his ledgers are catching light." Annie felt something warm cut through the cold dread in her chest at the plain worry in his voice, worry that was not possessive or controlling, only honest. "I have managed to look after myself a good long while, Mr. Fairchild. I do not doubt that for one moment." He came closer, close enough that she could see the fine grain of dust and worry lining his face. "I am not telling you what to do, Annie. I am asking you to be careful because I find I would take it very hard if something happened to you, and I have not got any right yet to say that plainer than I just did, but there it is anyway." The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere down the street, a mule brayed and a wagon wheel creaked past, and none of it seemed to matter half so much as the space between them, which had gone from several feet to almost none without either of them quite deciding to close it. Annie had spent 3 years running a boarding house full of men who talked around what they meant, who hemmed and edged and never simply said the true thing sitting in their chests, and she found she was tired, suddenly and completely, of waiting for someone else to say it first. She kissed him. It was not a long kiss, nor a practiced one on either side, but it was entirely her doing, her hand coming up to the rough stubble of his jaw, her mouth finding his with a certainty that surprised them both. When she drew back, Micah Fairchild looked at her with an expression somewhere between wonder and disbelief, as though a mustang he had spent weeks gentling had suddenly walked up and put its head against his chest of its own accord. "I have wanted to do that since you pulled me out of that creek," Annie admitted, a little breathless. "I did not see any particular reason to keep waiting on you to work up to it, given how much else there is to attend to." "No," Micah said, and there was a rough warmth in his voice now, something loosened and glad. "No, I do not suppose there was." He kissed her again, and this time it lasted considerably longer, and when they finally broke apart, Annie found she was laughing, soft and a little giddy, and Micah was smiling at her in a way that made him look years younger than his careful, weathered face usually allowed. "For a man so patient with frightened horses," she said, "you were remarkably slow to notice a woman was not frightened of you at all." "I was giving you time," he said. "You struck me as a woman who does not care to be rushed into anything." "I am a woman who does not care to wait once I have made up my mind," Annie corrected him. "There is a difference, Mr. Fairchild, and I would ask you to remember it." "I will try to keep it straight," he said, and kissed her a third time. And outside the window the June evening went on gold and ordinary, entirely unaware that everything between them had just changed. The trouble, when it came fast and came ugly, 3 days after that kiss and 11 days before Micah's foreclosure deadline. He had ridden out at dawn to check a stretch of fence along his north pasture, alone, because it was work he had done alone 100 times before, and saw no reason to think this morning would be different. He did not come in for the noon meal. He did not come in by supper. And when his ranch hand, an old cavalry veteran named Jonah Webb, rode the fence line looking for him in the fading light, he found Micah's gray gelding grazing loose with an empty saddle, a scuffed patch of ground telling a story of a struggle, and no sign of Micah Fairchild anywhere at all. Jonah rode straight into Larkspur Crossing that same night, half-lathered horse and all, and pounded on Annie's boarding-house door with a fear in his weathered face that told her the whole story before he ever got a full sentence out. "They have taken him," Jonah said, when she got him seated and calm enough to speak plainly. 2 sets of horse tracks besides his own, coming in from the east, and drag marks where they must have put him over a saddle. Tracked them best I could before the light went, and they are headed up toward Broken Ridge, into that canyon country nobody but old scouts and lost cattle ever go into." Annie's blood went to ice and then, almost immediately, to something harder and more useful. She had known fear before, plenty of it, but this was a fear that wanted doing, not weeping, and she set it to work at once. Kendrick's men, Sackett and Tolliver. That would be my guess, though I did not see them to swear to it. "He means to keep Micah out of the way until after the 4th of July, Annie said, thinking it through even as the words left her mouth. "If Micah cannot appear at his own foreclosure hearing to contest it, Kendrick forecloses uncontested, sells the water rights to the railroad before anyone is the wiser, and by the time Micah is found, it will all be finished and legal and impossible to undo." "Then we had best find him before the 4th, Jonah said grimly. "We had best find him considerably sooner than that." Annie was already moving, pulling her boots on, calling up the stairs for the two trail hands currently boarding with her, men she knew to be steady and well-armed, and more importantly, loyal to Micah Fairchild for having gentled horses that had saved their own lives more than once out on the trail. Broken Ridge is rough country. If we ride in blind, we will lose days searching canyons that all look alike, and days are exactly what we do not have. She sent word to Sheriff Walt Garrity, who agreed to ride with them though he was careful, in the way of small-town lawmen who valued their positions, to say he could not act officially against Cyrus Kendrick on suspicion alone. She gathered supplies, water, rope, her father's old field glasses, and on a hunch she could not entirely explain even to herself, her camera and two dry plates, wrapped carefully in oilcloth. And before first light the next morning, a party of 6 rode north out of Larkspur, crossing toward the tangled limestone canyons of Broken Ridge, following a cold trail that grew colder with every hour that passed. Broken Ridge was a wild stretch of country, even by Texas standards, a maze of steep-walled canyons and cedar breaks cut by generations of flash floods, a place where a man could hide a body or a captive for weeks and never be found by anyone who did not already know exactly where to look. They found the abandoned campsite where Micah's captors had apparently stopped for a night, cold ashes and a few tins of beans, but the trail beyond it split 3 ways among rock too hard to hold a print, and by the second afternoon of searching, Annie could feel the party's hope beginning to fray at the edges. "We are running out of canyon," Jonah said quietly, as they paused to water the horses at a trickling spring, "and running out of days besides." Annie did not answer right away. She was standing at the mouth of the canyon, field glasses raised, scanning the high ridgeline where the setting sun threw long gold light across broken rock, and she was thinking, with a fierce, aching hope, of every conversation she had ever had with Micah Fairchild about horses and patience, and never giving up on a frightened creature until it found its own way to trust. He would not simply wait to be found. She knew that about him now, knew it the way she knew the man's kiss and the man's steady hands and the man's quiet certainty in the face of danger. If there was any way at all for Micah to help find himself, he would be doing it. That was when she saw the smoke. It was faint, almost nothing, a thin gray thread rising from a high point along the ridge a mile or more distant, easily mistaken for a trick of the fading light. But even as she watched, it broke and rose again, a rhythm too deliberate to be accidental, 3 short plumes and then a pause and then 3 more. "There," she said, voice tight with sudden fierce hope, pointing. "That is not a wildfire and it is not a careless camp. Somebody is signaling." Sheriff Garrity squinted along her pointing arm and swore softly. "That is old cavalry signal work. 3 fires, pause, 3 fires. I have not seen that done since I rode with the Frontier Battalion." "Micah served with the Texas Rangers as a young man before he took up horse breaking," Jonah said slowly, wonder dawning in his weathered face. "His daddy taught him signal fires as a boy for calling help if stock went missing in bad country. I plumb forgot that till just now." "He is telling us where he is," Annie breathed. "He got loose enough, or his captors got careless enough, and he is telling us exactly where to find him." They rode hard for the ridge, racing the failing light, and found the trail up to the high point steep and treacherous, forcing them to lead the horses the last quarter-mile on foot over loose scree. Annie's lungs burned and her legs shook with the climb, but she did not slow, did not let herself think of anything but the thin gray smoke rising ahead of them, until at last they came up over a shoulder of broken rock and found Micah Fairchild kneeling beside a small signal fire, wrists still raw from rope that he had apparently worked loose himself, one eye swollen nearly shut, but alive, and turning toward them with an expression of such fierce relief that Annie felt her own eyes sting with sudden tears. "I knew you would think to look for smoke," he said, voice rough, as she half ran, half stumbled the last few yards to him and dropped to her knees at his side. "I did not know if I would get loose in time to light it before they came back." "Where are they?" Garrity had his revolver drawn, scanning the surrounding rocks. Rode down to check the lower trail an hour back, thinking I was still tied fast. They will be back directly and none too pleased to find me loose. Micah's good eye found Annie's face, and something in it softened despite the danger still crowding close around them. You came yourself. I told myself you would send Garrity and stay safe in town. I have never once in my life stayed safely anywhere I was told to, Annie said, hands shaking as she worked at the rope burns on his wrists. You ought to know that about me by now, Mr. Fairchild. I am beginning to, he said, and there was warmth enough in his rough voice to steady her hands despite everything. They did not have long to wait before Boone Sackett and Ray Tolliver came scrambling back up the trail, drawn by the smoke they should have snuffed out hours earlier, and the confrontation that followed was brief. And thanks to Sheriff Garrity's steady revolver and the sheer weight of numbers against them, entirely bloodless, though Sackett got in one wild swing before Jonah Webb put him flat on his back with a well-placed fist. Both men were bound with their own rope inside of 5 minutes, sullen and cursing, and Garrity informed them with grim satisfaction that kidnapping was a hanging offense in the state of Texas, and that he expected they would find a great deal of reason to talk before they reached the county jail. They did talk, eventually, once the ride back to Larkspur Crossing had given them time to consider their prospects, and what they said, given willingly in exchange for whatever leniency the circuit judge might grant a man who cooperated, was exactly what Annie had hoped for. That Cyrus Kendrick himself had ordered Micah Fairchild taken and held until after the 4th of July hearing, paying them $50 apiece for the job, and promising more once the foreclosure was finalized and the water rights sold on to the railroad survey. It was not quite enough, on its own, to prove the ledger fraud. But combined with Annie's photographs, with Micah's own testimony of the threats made against him, with Constance Hale's account of her vanished payment, and with the sworn statement Elias Prout could still be persuaded to give, wherever he had run to, it was very nearly enough to bring the whole rotten structure of Cyrus Kendrick's fortune crashing down. They rode back into Larkspur Crossing 2 days before the 4th of July, sunburned and saddle-sore and triumphant, to find that word of Micah's kidnapping and rescue had already run ahead of them through the town like wildfire, and that public sentiment, which had been cautiously suspicious of Cyrus Kendrick for weeks, had curdled overnight into open hostility. A land baron who ordered a well-liked local rancher kidnapped and held in the canyons was not a man the town cared to keep doing business with, whatever his standing at the Methodist Church. Elias Prout, as it turned out, had not run so far as everyone feared. He had gone to ground at his family's place near Comanche, exactly as his note had suggested, and it took only a single letter from Annie, along with the news that his testimony was now needed to save not just Constance Hale's farm but Micah Fairchild's ranch, and possibly the young clerk's own family note besides, to bring him back to Larkspur Crossing on the morning of the 4th, pale and nervous, but resolved, carrying with him the last piece of evidence Annie had not even known to hope for. A second, hidden set of the old ledgers, which he had smuggled out of the office in his coat lining the very night he fled, unable in the end to leave the true record entirely in Cyrus Kendrick's hands. The circuit hearing was held in the county courthouse on the 4th of July itself, Judge Harmon Cole presiding, a spare, deliberate man known up and down the circuit for having very little patience with foolishness and even less for corruption. The courtroom was packed past its capacity. Farmers and ranchers and their families crowded 3 deep along the walls, because word had spread through Larkspur Crossing that something more than one man's foreclosure was about to be settled that morning. Cyrus Kendrick arrived in his black coat despite the heat, composed and confident. Flanked by a lawyer from Fort Worth, he had clearly paid a great deal to bring in for the occasion. He looked, Annie thought, watching him take his seat, exactly like a man who still believed his money and his standing would carry him through whatever came next, and she felt a fierce, quiet satisfaction at the thought of watching that confidence crumble. It took the better part of 2 hours, Micah testified first, plain and steady, laying out the threats made against him, the kidnapping, the ledger discrepancy on his own account. Constance Hale followed, her voice shaking at first and then growing steadier as she spoke of watching her husband hand over that March payment with her own eyes. Elias Prout testified last among the witnesses, and it was his testimony, backed by the second set of ledgers he produced from a battered satchel, that finally broke the courtroom's held breath into open murmuring, page after page of entries that matched, exactly, the photographs Annie had taken weeks before. It was those photographs that Judge Cole examined longest, holding each print up to the light streaming through the courthouse windows, comparing them line by line against the ledger Prout had smuggled out, and the current book Kendrick's own lawyer was forced to produce for comparison. "These photographs are dated," the judge said finally, looking up over his spectacles at the packed courtroom. "The plates themselves bear a maker's stamp and a studio record I am given to understand Miss Ford keeps for every sitting she conducts, a ledger of her own, if you will, recording date and subject for every photograph she has taken in the past 3 years." He glanced at Annie, seated near the front beside Micah, and something almost like respect crossed his stern face. "It is a fortunate thing for the honest men and women of this county that Larkspur Crossing has a photographer inclined to keep such careful records." Cyrus Kendrick's composure did not crack all at once. It went slowly over the course of that long morning, his lawyer's objections growing more strained and less convincing with every witness, until finally, faced with the weight of photograph and ledger and testimony all pointing the same damning direction, he rose from his chair with his face gone the color of ash and attempted, in a last desperate gambit, to claim the whole matter was a conspiracy of jealous debtors and a photographer with a grudge. "A grudge, Mr. Kendrick." Judge Cole's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. "I have before me photographic evidence, corroborating ledgers, and sworn testimony from 4 separate witnesses, including your own former clerk, describing a systematic pattern of altered records used to manufacture defaults on notes held by working ranchers and farmers in this county, followed by the sale of foreclosed land to railroad interests at considerable personal profit to yourself. I have further testimony, now corroborated by 2 confessed accomplices currently sitting in the county jail, that you ordered the kidnapping of a rancher to prevent his testimony at this very hearing. I do not find any of that consistent with a grudge, sir. I find it consistent with fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to kidnap, and I intend to see you answer for all 3. The courtroom erupted. Annie found Micah's hand closing around hers beneath the crowded bench, warm and steady, and when she looked at him she found him watching not the judge, not Kendrick's ashen collapse into his chair, but her, with an expression of such open, unguarded pride that it took her breath more surely than the creek water had weeks before. Cyrus Kendrick was remanded to the county jail that same afternoon to await formal charges, his lone office placed under the temporary administration of the county, while the courts sorted out the fraudulent foreclosures, one by one, and reversed them. Constance Hale got her farm back within the week, along with a formal notation in the county records that her note had been paid in full since March, exactly as she had always claimed. The Draytons and the Ochoa family, and 2 others besides whose cases Elias Prout's smuggled ledger helped confirm, received the same relief in the weeks that followed. Micah Fairchild's own note was declared satisfied, his ranch and his water rights secure, and the proposed railroad spur, deprived of the cheap land Kendrick had promised to deliver, was quietly rerouted along a different stretch of the Brazos entirely, a fact that struck Annie as a small, satisfying justice all its own. Elias Prout, for his courage in coming forward, found himself something of a local hero rather than the disgraced clerk he had feared becoming, and was offered within the month a position keeping books for the very railroad survey office that had once nearly profited from his old employer's crimes. He took Annie's hand at the courthouse, steps the day the ruling came down, and thanked her with tears standing openly in his eyes. And Annie, who had spent 3 years listening to other people's troubles at her boarding house table, found herself unexpectedly moved to be thanked so plainly for finally doing something about one. It was 2 weeks after the hearing, on a warm evening in late July, with the worst of the summer heat finally beginning to break, that Micah Fairchild rode into Larkspur Crossing leading not a green-broke Mustang this time, but the same steady gray gelding that had carried Annie out of Cypress Creek, saddled and groomed as though for a special occasion. He found Annie on her boarding house porch, mending a torn hem by the last of the daylight, and stood at the bottom of the steps turning his hat in his hands with an awkwardness that made her set her sewing aside at once, curious. "You have the look of a man working up to something, Mr. Fairchild." "I have been working up to it the better part of a week," he admitted. Never could quite find the words that seemed equal to the occasion. "I have found," Annie said, coming down the steps to stand in front of him, "that the words rarely matter half so much as people think they do. It is usually the doing that counts. That is a comfort, given how poorly the words have been going." He took a breath, and some of the awkwardness fell away, replaced by the same steady, patient certainty she had first seen in him gentling a drowning horse out of a flooded creek. "Annie Ford, I have spent a good many years being told I have a gift for gentling frightened, difficult creatures who do not care to be led anywhere they have not chosen to go themselves. I find I have fallen in love with a woman who fits that description a good deal better than any horse I have ever worked, and who has never once needed gentling from me at all, only somebody willing to walk alongside her instead of trying to lead her anywhere. I would very much like to be that man for the rest of both our lives, if you would have me." Annie felt her throat tighten, laughter and tears crowding up together the way they sometimes did at moments too large to hold only one feeling at a time. "Are you comparing our courtship to breaking a horse, Micah Fairchild?" "I am saying," he said, with the ghost of that rare, crooked smile she had come to love so well, "that I have never in my life met a creature, horse or otherwise, so entirely unbroken and unbreakable as you, and I do not want to spend the rest of my days trying to change one single thing about that. I only want to be standing close enough to watch it." "That," Annie said, closing the last distance between them, "is a considerably better answer than anything about gentling. See that you remember the difference. I will do my level best. You may kiss me now if you are still working up the nerve." He was not, as it turned out, working up the nerve at all, and the kiss that followed was slow and certain and entirely unhurried. Out on the porch in the fading golden light, with the whole rebuilt, righted town of Larkspur Crossing settling into its evening quiet around them. When they finally broke apart, Annie found she was laughing again, the same soft, giddy laugh from weeks before, and Micah was watching her with an expression of such open, unguarded happiness that it made something in her chest ache in the very best way. "I have not actually said yes yet," she pointed out, "if we are being precise about it. You have not said no either, which I have learned to take as a very promising sign where you are concerned." "Yes," Annie said, before he could work himself into another round of nervous hat-turning. "Yes, Micah Fairchild, I will marry you, on the condition that you understand plainly, now and forever, that I intend to keep running my boarding house and my studio both, and that I will not be gentled into giving up either one. I would not have you any other way," he said, and meant it so completely that Annie felt the last small worry she had not even known she was carrying, some old fear of being asked to become smaller to fit into a man's life, dissolve entirely away. They were married 3 weeks later, on a bright August morning, in the same Methodist church whose roof Cyrus Kendrick had once funded to such public gratitude, and whose new deacon, appointed after Kendrick's disgrace and conviction, presided over the ceremony with evident pleasure at the fittingness of it. Constance Hale sat in the second pew with her 2 boys freshly scrubbed and solemn, and Elias Prout stood as an usher, and Jonah Webb gave away the bride at Annie's own insistence, since her father had not lived to see this day, and Jonah, in the way of good ranch hands who become family without anyone quite deciding it, had earned the honor over the long, hard weeks of the search. Annie wore a dress of pale blue that she had photographed herself in a small mirror the evening before, laughing at her own vanity, and kept the print afterward in a frame beside her father's old camera, a record, she told Micah, that some things were worth holding still long enough to remember exactly as they had been. They settled at the Fairchild Ranch, 8 miles north along Cypress Creek, though Annie kept her boarding house running in town under the capable daily management of a widow she had long trusted, riding in twice a week to see to the books and catch up on whatever news had passed through her old dining table in her absence, because some habits, she told Micah, a woman did not care to give up simply because she had gotten married. Micah, for his part, found he did not want her to give it up at all, took a quiet pride, in fact, in being married to a woman half the county still came to for advice and truth in equal measure, and never once in all their years together asked her to be smaller than she was. The old bridge over Cypress Creek was rebuilt that autumn, stronger and higher than before, funded properly this time out of county money, no longer siphoned off toward a corrupt land baron's private ambitions, and Micah and Annie rode across it together the day it reopened, side by side, her hand resting easy in the crook of his arm, both of them remembering, without needing to say so aloud, exactly what that same crossing had once nearly cost them, and exactly what it had in the end so unexpectedly given them instead.